40 below zero, the rare temperature that reads exactly the same on both the Fahrenheit scale and the Celsius scale. One room built from rough logs, with gaps you could slide a knife through, warmed by a single fire that any modern expert will tell you sends most of its heat straight up the chimney. On paper, the people inside should have frozen before sunrise. So how did frontier families survive that same brutal cold, night after night, for months on end, and live to do it again the very next winter? The answer has almost nothing to do with the fire. It comes down to what they did to the walls, to the ground around the cabin, and to the stone itself, long before the first cold snap ever arrived. The story of how these cabins held their heat does not start with the fireplace at all. It starts with a problem every settler ran into the moment the last log was rolled into place. Wood feels warm and solid under your hand, and a thick wall of stacked timber looks like it could hold back anything the sky throws at it. The hard numbers tell a very different story. Even good insulating wood gives you only about 1 to 1.5 points of what builders today call R value for every inch of thickness. So a log wall 6 inches thick lands somewhere around an R value of 9. A modern house built for those same northern winters aims for 2 to 4 times that much in the walls alone. Think about that for a second. The famous log cabin, the symbol of frontier toughness, was a weaker insulator than the cheapest wall a builder would frame up today. Put plainly, those celebrated walls leaked about as fast as a thick quilt thrown over a fence. And that was actually the good news, because the solid wood was never the real enemy. The real enemy was everything happening in the spaces between the logs. No two logs ever sit perfectly against each other. They twist, they taper, they shrink as they dry, and they leave long, ragged gaps running the entire length of every wall. On a still day, those gaps are merely annoying. On a night with a 40 below wind, driving across open prairie, they become open wounds, pulling warm air out and dragging frozen air in faster than any fire could ever replace it. Moving air is what actually steals your heat, far more than still cold ever does on its own, and a drafty cabin is really just a slow machine for pumping your warmth out into the dark. So the settlers sealed it, by hand, with whatever the land gave them. The mix had a name. The outer layer was the chinking, and the softer inner filler was the daubing. And the recipe changed with whatever was within walking distance of the build. Clay, sand, and lime formed the backbone. Into that they worked straw, dried grass, moss, animal hair, and on the poorest claims, torn up rags and old clothing. Anything fibrous that would bind the mud together and keep it from cracking out of the joints. And the mud was only half of it. Before any of that wet mix went on, the widest gaps were packed first with whatever solid scraps were on hand. Thin split wood wedges, flat stones, even dried corn cobs driven in tight. That rough packing was the original meaning of chinking, the structural filler that bridged the open space, while the daubing was the mud troweled over the top to seal the whole thing against the weather. Layered that way, a gap wide enough to pass your hand through could be closed up solid and weather tight. Here's the detail almost everyone misses. This was never a one-time job. As the logs kept drying and shifting through their first few seasons, the chinking worked loose and crumbled. So refilling every gap and hole was a chore that came around year after year, usually right before winter, the way we would service a furnace today. A well-kept cabin had hands pressing fresh daubing into its seams every single autumn. Not every cabin even needed much of it. A handful of master builders, especially those trained in the Scandinavian tradition, could scribe and notch their logs so tightly that the timbers locked together almost airtight on their own, with barely a gap left to fill. That kind of work took skill and time most settlers simply did not have when winter was coming, and the walls still had to go up fast. For everyone else, the daubing was the difference between life and a slow freeze. The better-off families went a step further and coated the whole exterior in whitewash, which sealed the smaller cracks as it dried and hardened, adding one more thin layer against the wind. Get that seal right, and you had turned a leaking wooden cage into something that could finally hold a pocket of still, warm air. But sealing the walls only solved the top of the problem. Down at the bottom, where the lowest log met the cold ground, the cabin was still bleeding heat into the earth. And that is where the second trick came in. They banked it. Banking simply meant piling material against the base of the outside walls, all the way around, to choke off the drafts sneaking under that bottom log and to wrap the coldest part of the cabin in a thick protective skirt. In the fall, that meant heaping up earth, dead leaves, straw, even manure against the lower walls. Then, once winter set in, it meant snow. Snow sounds like the last thing you would want packed against your house, but snow is full of trapped air, and trapped air is one of the best insulators there is. Every inch of packed snow adds roughly one more point of R value to whatever it is leaning against. Pile it 2 to 4 feet high around the walls, and you have wrapped the base of the cabin in a free, renewing blanket that gets rebuilt with every storm. It is the exact same principle that kept the root cellar from freezing. Dig down into the ground, or bank earth up around something, and you borrow the steady, stubborn temperature of the soil, which barely moves while the air above it swings wildly from afternoon to midnight. The timing mattered as much as the material. The earth went up in the fall, while the ground was still soft enough to dig and move. So the cabin was already skirted before the first hard freeze locked everything solid. After that, every snowfall became a gift instead of a burden. Another layer to pack against the walls. A common method was to lean a wide board against the cabin a couple of feet out from the wall, then shovel snow into the gap and tamp it down tight, building a clean vertical bank that the wind could not easily strip away. This idea was so reliable that northern trappers swore by it for their line cabins, and there are accounts of families whose main heat source failed in the dead of winter, with the temperature outside sitting around 30 below, who rushed out and shoveled snow up against every wall they could reach. Within hours, the inside warmed, and the frost that had been creeping across the interior walls simply pulled back and vanished. That looks far too simple to work, but it was pure physics, and they'd figured it out by living through the alternative. If you're finding this useful, take a second to subscribe. I dig into forgotten frontier skills like this one every single week, the kind of thing people used to know in their bones. Now, while all of this sealing and banking was going on outside, the most important work was happening at the very center of the cabin, around the one feature we've been told all along was keeping everyone alive. Here's the uncomfortable truth about the classic open fireplace. It's one of the worst heaters ever put inside a home. A roaring open hearth can send something like 80% of its heat straight up the flue, and the moment the flames die down, the warmth dies with them, sometimes within minutes. That's exactly why the old cabins kept a fire smoldering around the clock through the hardest months. There was no lighting a single fire and calling it a night, not with an open hearth. The fire never really got to rest, and neither did whoever was feeding it. The people who actually cracked the single fire problem weren't leaning on the flames at all. They were leaning on stone. Pay attention to this next part, because it's the piece that explains everything. A heavy mass of stone or brick doesn't just sit there. It soaks up heat slowly while the fire burns hot, holds onto it like a battery, and then releases that warmth back into the room for hours after the last ember has gone gray. That's a heat sink. And it's the difference between heat you have to constantly make and heat you can store. You can feel a faint version of it in any old stone building that stays cool deep into summer and slow to chill in winter. Stone takes a long time to warm and a long time to let go, and the settlers turned that stubbornness into a feature. The ones who understood this best came from the cold corners of Northern and Eastern Europe, and they carried a design with them that puts a lot of modern heating to shame. There's a reason it took hold where it did. In those colder, more crowded regions, wood had grown scarce and expensive, and some governments actually pushed their craftsmen to invent stoves that could wring the most heat from the least fuel. Necessity did the engineering. What came out of it went by many names: the Russian stove, the Finnish hearth, the German Kachelofen. The idea behind all of them is the same. You build a massive core of stone or brick, sometimes weighing a couple of tons, and you run the smoke from the fire through a long, winding maze of channels buried inside that mass before it's ever allowed to escape up the chimney. Instead of the heat racing outside, it gets trapped in the stone on the way out. You burn one hot, fast fire, maybe two on the bitterest days, and that single firing can radiate gentle, even warmth into the home for 12 to 24 hours. One fire, a whole day of heat. That design worked so well that even today, the vast majority of new homes in Finland are still built around a wood-burning masonry core. And that is the real answer hiding inside the legend of the cabin that survived on a single fire. This is the part that never made it into the storybooks. And for the families who couldn't build a 2-ton stone stove, there was a humble cousin of the very same trick. They'd heat ordinary stones in the fire through the evening, wrap them in cloth, and tuck them into the beds and under the feet of children, sending a slow trickle of stored warmth through the coldest hours of the night, long after the main fire had faded. We tend to picture the frontier bed as nothing but piled furs and shivering. A single warm stone changed that night completely. But this was never about one clever trick winning out over the others. It was about all of them stacking together. And that is the part the romantic version of the story leaves out. The sealed seams from the chinking kept the warm air from leaking out the sides. The banked earth and snow choked off the drafts at the floor and borrowed the ground's steady heat. The stone soaked up the fire and gave it back slowly through the night. There was a reason they fought just as hard for every layer overhead too. Heat rises, and the roof was the easiest place of all to lose it. So under the hand-split shingles, they often tucked a thick mat of thatch or bark, a quiet extra blanket, sitting right where the warm air collected. And surrounding all of it was one more advantage we forget to count. These cabins were tiny, often a single low room with a sleeping loft, sometimes with livestock bedded down just beyond a wall, adding their body heat to the room. A small space with a low ceiling is far easier to keep warm than the big open rooms we live in today. Let's be honest about what warm really meant out there, though. This was survival, not comfort the way we define it now. In a hard, cold snap, water could still freeze in a bucket in the far corner, away from the hearth. The loft might stay frigid, while the space near the stone stayed livable. Their real achievement was holding a pocket of survivable, sometimes even pleasant warmth around the heart of the home, through a night cold enough to kill an unsheltered person using nothing but mud, dirt, snow, stone, and a fire they understood better than most of us understand our own thermostats. So yeah, not bad at all for people we like to imagine as simple. What's remarkable is that no one on that prairie had ever heard the term R-value. There were no energy ratings, no building codes, no blower door tests. Every bit of this got worked out the hard way, passed down from one freezing winter to the next, refined by the brutal feedback of a season that punished every mistake. They were running real building science generations before it had a name. And then, as central heating spread and the old cabins fell away, almost all of that hard-won knowledge quietly slipped out of living memory. The walls they sealed, the snow they banked, and the stone they trusted kept families alive through winters we can barely imagine, and that's a kind of genius worth remembering. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please feel free to like and subscribe. And if you would like to continue watching more of my videos on frontier skills, you can click the video on the screen now.